What is the nature of prayer in Buddhism? And what is the role of dilemmas in spiritual growth? Are religions really a centuries-long conversations about a certain question? And what are these different questions? My name is Ari-Pekka Skarp, and this is the Laboratory of Mind podcast. So welcome to the Laboratory of Mind podcast. I'm having a conversation with Ken McLeod, who's a long-time practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism and author of several books. His latest book, The Magic of Vajrayana, we actually discussed in this podcast a little more than a year ago. It was a very nice conversation. It's really nice to have you back, Ken. Welcome.
It's my pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation last time, and I look forward to a similar conversation today.
Yeah. So I actually contacted you a little while ago because I had this dilemma that I wanted to have your kind of viewpoints also. And this dilemma concerns something that we touched a little bit in our last conversation when we talked about the prayer and meditation. But it's a little bit wider thing, I think. And this time I was asking you about this dilemma of God, prayer, and Buddhist meditation. This is a combination that is quite rarely discussed, at least in those circles that I've been around, because usually these are seen as incompatible. But my own personal experience is that I've been living and raised in a country where, for example, Christianity has been for several hundred years, and that of course has some effect also in how my kind of mind has been built. And on the other hand, I've been doing Buddhist meditation for more than 20 years. But this dilemma is something that I haven't really resolved, that I kind of don't feel these things to be incompatible, but at the same time, I feel that these are usually seen as things that you can't really combine. So basically this was the starting point of my kind of contact with you. So I don't know, where would you want to start with this?
Well, that's a very good question. Most of us have been raised in a culture with, I'm going to broaden it a bit from Christianity, but let's say a monotheistic tradition. Whether it's Judaism or Christianity, whatever, most of us have been raised in that kind of monotheistic religious tradition, if we've been raised in any religious tradition at all. In this country anyway, there are very large numbers of people now who have no real religious training or background. They're even though they're embedded in a culture which is based in those principles, they've led what might completely secular lives. And there's a very significant difference in how the collection of religions we know as Buddhism and the collection of religions we know as the Abrahamic tradition view the world, view the divine or the sacred or the transcendent, whatever term we want to call it. And out of that, these traditions have evolved various approaches to prayer and meditation. So I think one place that we might start, if it's okay with you, is for you to put the dilemma that you are experiencing or have been contemplating, put that into words in the best way that you think you can. And would that be okay?
When I first encountered Buddhism, I think in like 25 years or so, I studied what it means, what kind of beliefs and practices it contains. But really, my kind of a motivation for studying Buddhism was that I had a spiritual experience that I wanted to understand more. So one source that seemed quite fruitful for that study or research was Buddhism, because especially in Zen Buddhism, there seemed to be this quite big emphasis on the spiritual experience. And so when I started to study Buddhism, I also started to practice it. I kind of found out some groups where I could discuss, have conversations with people and kind of explore these things that I've been experiencing. And little by little, I kind of became part of the groups doing the Buddhist practices, wearing the clothes that were worn in those retreats and doing the rituals and all that. But there were also some, I guess, beliefs or dogmas that weren't so apparent at first in the Buddhism. And some of those concerned what I am, who am I, what is this person, and what is this world we are living, which we are experimenting with the meditation practices. And little by little, I kind of realized that there were some things that I wasn't agreeing with the teachers at that time that I met. But I didn't talk about these things because, what do I know? I was just a novice in these Buddhist circles, and perhaps I just didn't have enough insights to understand these things. But these dilemmas didn't kind of weren't resolved, at least not in the way that I would have taken the Buddhist dogmas and thought about those to be the truth of the world and of me. So I guess that I kind of have always felt that there's some part of me who kind of has a longing for example, prayer and some kind of greater power, higher power, God. And is kind of trying to have a relationship with that part also. And I felt that in Buddhism there were some dilemmas. This was kind of a heretic way of thinking or feeling in many of those groups. And I think that it also had an effect that I had a hard time to really belong to any certain group, because I know that I cannot have the same opinions or worldviews that are kind of advocated in those groups, even though there was many things that I really liked and felt was important for me. For example, these practices that we were doing. Yeah. Can you see the dilemma here?
I think I can see part of it, but I'd like to see a bit more of it. Describe to me the dilemma around prayer.
The dilemma around prayer. Well, there are times when I feel very vulnerable in my life. Perhaps I have some fear or some quite big things going on in my life, and sometimes I kind of feel that this prayer is one way to go on. But on the other hand, in those Buddhist circles that I have been part of, prayer isn't one of the practices. And especially if you kind of think about prayer as something to build your conscious contact with something other than yourself, or emptiness, or whatever are these words that I used.
I'm inferring from what you had said earlier that your training and the groups were primarily Zen groups. Is that correct?
Yes, in my early years of practice, yes.
Yeah, because Japanese Buddhism, there are, broadly speaking, three traditions. There's Zen, Soto and Rinzai, and then there's the Pure Land tradition centered around Amitabha. And there's also the Tendan Shingon, which are more in the Vajrayana. If you were to go to Pure Land temple or church or whatever, you find it very different. The forms very different. Actually, you find them very similar to Protestant Christianity, because they actually were modeled on that. And there's a place for, very definitely a place for prayer there. So I'm wondering to what extent you may have explored that, or if not, why not, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, I did explore these kinds of sects of Buddhism in recent years, but these were not kind of available around here at 20 years ago when I was studying my practices. Yeah.
Do they fit? Do they? What's your feeling about them? Since you've now explored them, do you feel that they help with this dilemma, or they don't answer it at all?
No, actually, I was doing some retreats in local Vietnamese monastery here, which are kind of combining the Amitabha or the Pure Land practices and Vietnamese Zen practice. Mm-hmm. So there was definitely this kind of, let's say, similarities to this kind of prayer type of practices there. On the other hand, there is something different there still, because and this is really hard for me to actually put my finger into, because I don't really know what would be the main difference there, praying for rebirth in a Pure Land, or praying for to get into heaven in a Christian sense. Those seem to be quite similar things, at least from this life point of view.
Well, I think the descriptions of the Amitabha's Pure Land are much more precise than any description I've ever seen of heaven.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I'm not. That's one difference I note. But the form seems to be quite similar. But even so, you feel there's something different. Can you get a little closer to that, do you think?
Well, perhaps this is the second part of the dilemma, because I don't feel to be a Christian either. I cannot subscribe to the dogmas of Christianity or any monotheistic religion that I know. So I kind of feel that I'm kind of in between of these traditions, in the sense that there seem to be many things that I kind of have been practicing and found very good in Buddhist traditions. But there are lots of dogmas that I cannot subscribe to. And the same goes with Christianity or any other religions, really, that I kind of looked into a little bit more deeply.
Okay. I think this gives us a place to start. So let's start off as ordinary human beings, you and me. And both of us have been drawn to some form of spiritual practice. We've both taken it quite seriously, occupied a significant, if not a central portion of our lives. And why do we do this?
That's a good question.
Okay, well, let's make it personal. My case, I was attracted, for reasons I don't really know, to mysticism, really. Certainly in my teens, if not a bit earlier. And there was something there I wanted to know. It didn't involve God per se or anything, but there was, I think, though I didn't formulate it this way to myself at that age, but I think inherent in that there was a possibility of a radically different relationship with life, radically different understanding of what it means to be alive or be a human being or something like that. In Hinduism, it was couched in terms of union of the individual Atman with the universal Atman. Christianity. I had problems with Christianity from a very young age. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. I've come to appreciate it more over the years, but at the time, even though I looked at it quite seriously, I had problems with it. Buddhism attracted me more, and over the years, and eventually I ended up pursuing Buddhism to some depth, and still do. It's, my life is basically organized and has been for many, many years. But exactly why is something that I've come to understand in different ways over the years. Other people I know want to have a more personal relationship with a superior being, such as God or what have you, or a supreme being. That aspect was never very strong for me. But that's, as you know from reading some of my books, and I don't think I'm very different here, but the spiritual path is not particularly easy. You run into difficulties and problems that you never expected to run into. And I certainly did. And they were very, very hard. And so a lot of people asked me, well, why didn't you stop? And I had to think about that question very carefully. And I looked, and I couldn't see anything that was based on family patterns there. I couldn't see anything that was based on some kind of psychological compensation or anything like that. And eventually, all I could say is, the idea of stopping never occurred to me. And it wasn't that I was obsessed with it. It wasn't that kind of thing. And that understanding, which came through examining myself over and over again, okay, this is something that means something that's clearly very important to me, even if I can't put it into words. You follow?
Yes.
And now I think I have a better understanding, but of why. And it's contained in the simple phrase in Buddhism. Nirvana is peace. And I was looking for peace. And then I realized that that's actually what Buddha was looking for, too. If you go back to the life story of Buddha, he's raised as this prince in a, royal family, and he is surrounded by luxury and care and sheltered from the cruel realities of the world, shall we say. And he ventures out into the world with his chariot driver and encounters an old man. What's that? He looks terrible. Well, that's old man. What does that mean? It's what happens when you get older. That's terrible. Then he encounters a sick person, and then a corpse. And he also encounters a religious mendicant who is completely at peace. And he just can't understand. Here are these horrible aspects of life which he's just been exposed to: old age, illness, and death. And here's someone who doesn't seem to be disturbed by them. And that's what initiated his spiritual search. That dilemma, if you want, or paradox. And the peace that he was seeking, and I can say the peace that I have sought, is not an ordinary. It's not just everything's nice. I think there's a Christian term which I find captures it very well. It's a peace that passeth understanding. So it's a peace outside of the domain of the conceptual mind, if you follow. And now some people talk about that in terms of freedom or being awake or whatever. But basically, it still comes down to you can meet whatever life throws at you and you're not disturbed by it. It's not that you're oblivious to it or you just ignore it or suppress it or anything like that. But you can, okay, this is what life's throwing at me. And you can meet it. And you can meet your own death. So one can be at peace in one's life. And there's all sorts of stuff built up around that, of course. But at its core, I think that's what Buddhism is about. And certainly, I've come to appreciate its depth. Right now, I'm translating the Diamond Sutra. It's never been translated from Tibetan, as far as I can tell. I think there's one translation, but I can't find it anywhere. But so I'm looking at Sanskrit and Chinese, translations from the Sanskrit and Chinese. And it's a very what it's talking about is not exactly obvious, and it takes a little bit of digging. So, but I think it's in line with what I'm talking about. We can talk about that more later if you're interested. So that understanding of what I was doing in spiritual practice, what drew me to it, has emerged and evolved over the years. Certainly could not have phrased that at the beginning. But one thing I can say, one of the reasons that I didn't stop, even though it was very difficult, is that I felt, and this is using again a Christian terminology rather than Buddhist, a calling. And there was a yearning in my heart, if you wish, which I couldn't ignore. And I needed to respond to that. So, what about you?
Well, I was thinking that I told you that I encountered Buddhism after I had this spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I wasn't seeking for that experience. I didn't know anything about these kind of experiences or whatever. But after that, I was just so interested in this new viewpoint to the world that I just I wanted to explore it more. it kind of it wasn't just peace. I think it was more like there was a richness of meaning in everything, and this was the motivating factor for me, because it didn't matter whether you were kind of exploring a flower, pick a flower from the ground, explore it, or whatever, conversation with a person, watching the trees, just being somewhere, no matter what, there was a richness of meaning. And I wanted to understand more about this. What is this thing that is happening? Are there other people who I can kind of share and have conversations about these things? And, I was kind of longing for company, people to share these things. And I was searching from the Buddhist groups because of what I have read. There are people who have kind of spiritual experiences, and they explore those with koan practices and whatever. So I think this is for me the most meaningful thing, and has been all these years. And I have there was actually a time when I was drawn away from Buddhism because I had some disillusionment with some things that were happening in one of the groups. And for several years, I didn't have anything to do with Buddhist practices. Well, actually, I did do meditation practice, but I kind of read Krishnamurti and some other people. But then I actually was listening to this Finnish monk who was reading some sutta. And I actually realized that sutta had in a very condensed form, that kind of experiences that I had been trying to figure out by myself for a few years. And
do you remember the name of the sutra?
I think it was Arittha Sutta.
The which?
Arittha Sutta. Yeah, it's not very well known. I hadn't heard about that before. But it kind of describes stages of development in a meditation practice, or at least this is one way to interpret it. And I was kind of amazed about that wow, just in a few lines, there are these things that I've been trying to figure out by myself for several years, reading psychology and neuroscience and whatever. So I figured that perhaps I will have another look on the Buddhist teachings, because it might be faster, and so I think for me these have been the most important things. But it's not just in Buddhism. I can see traces of it in many other spiritual traditions also. And perhaps this is something that I find some contradictions in myself, within myself, from time to time, because I'm not kind of what's the word, monogamous with one religion only.
Well, there's a movie called Bob Aziz, Babaziz. And subtitle is The Prince Who Contemplated His Soul. You can probably find it to rent on Amazon or something like that. It's a story of a old man, a Sufi dervish, and his great niece, very young girl. And they're on their way to somewhere. They get caught in a sandstorm. That's how the movie starts. And every now and then, the grandniece asks her great uncle question. One of the questions said, is there only one path to God? And the Sufi dervish replies, there are as many paths to God as there are souls in the universe. I think it's a line from Rumi. And I think it's a very good starting place, particularly in today's world. Within Buddhism, for instance, is this saying that there are 84,000 different teachings. Well, 84,000 just means a large number. But one way to understand that is that in all of the whole range of teachings in Buddhism, in all the different religions that comprise the Buddhist tradition, there's an awful lot of stuff. And in this, we need to train and understand. And as we come to understand something through our training, then we need to find the practices and the ways of practice that actually speak to us. And in this way, we forge our own path. Though it's not something we possess, it's just we forge a path that we end up taking. You see what I mean? It's not my path. We don't own it. Just the one that formed as we move forward, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's an important distinction. So one of the ways I found very helpful is that there's a definition of religion which I came across reading a book called The Religious Case Against Belief by a guy called James Carse, that's Carse. And he defines a religion as a centuries-long conversation about a certain topic, a certain question. I found this very helpful because I found that the question in Buddhism is really easy. How does one live at peace in a life shaped by old age, illness, and death? That's what Buddha set out to find, and he did. And what he found is that there's a different way of relating to life, which he described as being awake, which is what the term Buddha means. And even though he had all kinds of difficulties going through his life, he was basically at peace with everything that arose. And the question in Christianity is also pretty accessible. I think it's, how does the divine take expression in the world? Which is exactly what Christ's life was about. Son of God, how does he live in the world? Well, he ended up getting killed. But there's a very definite answer to that question, which I explored with a friend, and came out of that conversation. The question in Judaism is different, even though it's in the Abrahamic tradition. And it's what you're describing about yourself reminds me of this, because you remember Abraham, God says, you need to sacrifice your son to me. And Abraham says, what? And so there's this whole story of Abraham and Isaac. And raised in the Protestant tradition in Canada, I always thought this was a stupid story, but I worked with a psychologist for a few years. We did a number of programs together, and when we were planning one of the programs, we started to discuss some of the stuff, and he brought up, well, I think we should discuss the question of Abraham and Isaac. And I said, that's just such a dumb story. I don't know why you're even suggesting that. And he said, oh, you don't understand the story then, Ken. I said, no, I guess I don't. Tell me about it. And he said, well, God asks Abraham tells Abraham he has to sacrifice his son. What kind of God would do that? Would you want to have a relationship with a God that would ask you to sacrifice your own son? And Abraham says, well, okay. Well, what kind of father would do that? Would you want such a person that would, if you were their son, they would actually sacrifice you? And he says, this story raises all of these questions. So every time you visit the story, you have to deal with all of those questions. And I went, oh, it's a dilemma story. Because that was the kind of story I knew from some other reading I'd done. And then the story just becomes extraordinarily rich. But it also clued me in, because what's happening in the Old Testament is the kind of thing that happened to you. Moses finds himself talking to a burning bush. And then Ezekiel and Ezra and all of these different prophets, there's a voice coming out of the sky or telling them to do things. And so the question in Judaism, I think, is how do you relate to the divine? Because it seems to come out of the blue, and there it is. How do you relate to it? And it's what gives rise to the Torah and the law, because this is how you relate to it. You obey it. And then you have these endless discussions, which has made the Jewish tradition so rich, of what does it mean to obey? What is the law here? Et cetera, et cetera. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So there we have, how do you relate to the divine? And that's a question for a lot of people. And then in Christianity, you have, how does the divine take expression in the world? That's a different question. Question in Islam stumped me for quite a long time. And eventually I read a short book called A Way of Meaning or something. Can't remember the name of it now. It was an introduction to Islam. It was by a Sufi imam in New York, and I'd heard him give a talk, and I was very impressed by him, because he was unapologetically religious, and he was absolutely clear about things. And this is interesting. And when I finished the book, I didn't read it to get an answer to this question, but I realized I did get an answer. And that is, the question in Islam, I think, is how do you create a society which embraces the divine? Now, you have that question cropping up in Christianity, you even have it cropping up in Judaism, and you have all these questions cropping up in all three traditions, but each one has a slightly different emphasis. The question in Taoism is, How do you live in balance with this world we experience? So there's much more about how you engage the world in Taoism than there is, for instance, in Buddhism, even though the questions seem very similar. I talked to a friend of mine who's been looking into the various Indian religions, and her perspective is that the primary question the Vedanta or the Vedas are talking about is, why are we here? But this business of really looking at what is one's own spiritual question. And that actually takes quite a bit of digging. So I think it's a good place to explore. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you move from Buddhism to Christianity or something like that. But it does tell you what to look for in whatever tradition you feel the most resonance. So the people who practice Pure Land are looking for something that's a little different from what people in Zen are. Even though originally Shinran, I think it was, and what's his name? Dogen, they were contemporaries. And, Dogen prayed to Amitabha and practiced meditation. Shinran practiced meditation and prayed to Amitabha. It was their followers that created the difference. And then you have these two really different schools. But if you look at Chan in Chinese Buddhism, for instance, you find that they're constantly praying to Amitabha, even though they're practicing Zen Chan meditation. So these things just evolve differently, but the questions are a little different. And I think it's really, really important to get clear about that in oneself. Though that is not easy to do, but there's a lot of things about spiritual practice that are not easy, and that's just one more. But then I found that this opens a lot of doors if you do this. Because, for instance, let's take the question that I find myself resonating with. How do I live at peace in a life shaped by old age, illness, and death? Well, the answer in Buddhism is very clear. You develop a way of experiencing life that allows you to meet but not be consumed or have to suppress any reactivity, and you don't fall into confusion. You follow?
Yeah.
Those two things. You are free from the tyranny of reactivity. You don't have to react. And you're out of the dungeon of confusion. Which is primarily conceptual because we're trapped by language, etc. And I'm sure you can relate to that. So, okay, that sounds very nice. But I don't know how to do that. And this is what moved me to write about prayer and the magic of Vajrayana. Because at various points in my practice, I was asked to, said, do this. I didn't know how to do it. So I started to pray. I'm not even sure what I was praying to. But for me, prayer was a way of reaching out to what I didn't know, but wanted to know. And it was how I began to form a relationship with what I wanted to know but didn't know. Do you follow?
Yes.
And that can be compassion. It can be death. It can be what it means to be awake. It can be bodhisattva. It can be anything within that. And I think that is at the heart of prayer. Because why do we pray to God? It's to form a relationship with God. And I read about an interview on BBC. I don't know who the nun was, because the piece that I read didn't mention it. But the interviewer asked this Catholic nun, I'm pretty sure, when you pray to God, what do you ask for? And the nun replied, I don't ask for anything. Because everybody's idea of prayer is that you're asking for something, right? That's just one form of prayer. So the interviewer then said, well, what do you say to God? Well, I don't say anything. The interviewer is having a hard time now. Says, well, yes. What do you do when you pray? I listen. Well, what do you listen to? I listen to God. Now the interviewer is happy. He thinks he's onto something. He says, well, what does God say to you? Well, he doesn't say anything. Well, what does God tell you? He doesn't tell me anything. Well, what's God doing when you're praying to him? I don't know. Maybe he's listening too. I thought it was just wonderful that, I mean, you can just feel that a relationship is forming. But it's a relationship that isn't dependent on words or concepts or anything. And yet there's a relationship. I just love that story.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story.
And because we're so used to relating to the world through words. And one thing spiritual practice, and pretty well any tradition, is no, words are not enough for this. You have to learn to relate to your spiritual practice without words. They all have different traditions. The Zen people love their koans, which stop your mind. You can't think. Now you have to relate without words. In the Tibetan tradition, you have Mahamudra and Dzogchen pointing out instructions on things. Same thing. You know, one instruction that a teacher gave to me at one point was, pray to your teacher until you stop thinking and rest there. Well, that was a pretty powerful combination of prayer and meditation. You pray until you have no words. Now, not many people are told to pray that way, but that's a pretty wonderful instruction. When I first got it, I went, yeah. But as I thought about it and worked with it, I realized it was actually very, very profound. So I don't know whether any of this is helpful to you. I'd be interested to hear from you how it's striking you.
Yeah. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's a pretty important insight what you brought this, the question. What is the question? And I can see how these different traditions are actually formed around a question or set of similar questions, theme. Yeah. And I was actually also thinking about what are my questions. In our conversation here, I was kind of scanning back what I was telling you and what were these questions. And I actually found out that at least one question that I'm aware of is this, well, there are several actually. How does the meaning express in the world in different ways. And how can you kind of form a connection to that meaning in different situations, life situations, wherever. But I also felt that these questions might also be a little different for a modern person. I was thinking that this, at least I find myself pondering over several of these questions. I don't know if it's the situation in the world that kind of creates these different questions for me, or is it something how I'm built up personally? But I also can feel a little bit kind of dropping in between different questions.
Say that again, please.
Dropping in between different questions. It's almost like when you are diving deep in one question, it starts to raise up new questions.
It's rather inconvenient, that, isn't it?
Yeah, but on the other hand, I was also thinking that this feeling of contradiction, the dilemma, is also very important if you are talking about a question, because without it, you don't have energy or motivation to explore the question.
Yeah. Well, the dilemma is, in a certain sense, the expression of the question.
Yeah.
It is the question. So you sit in the dilemma.
Yes.
Or you pray to the dilemma.
Yeah. So in a sense, if you could resolve the contradiction, you would probably lose energy.
Well, not necessarily. It might free up energy. And now you live from there, and you are full of energy.
Yeah. I can sense what you are meaning, but could you elaborate it?
Well, what I found in my own experience, and certainly in my experience with students, is that, well, let me give you an example. And I used to have small groups, usually 5 to 8 people. We would meet every 2 weeks. And for usually about 6 to 8 months on this particular body of teaching or practice. And in one of these groups, I think it was on 4 measurables: love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. A woman said that she didn't know what the right thing to do was in a certain situation. And I said, do you want to elaborate on the actual situation? And she said, well, it concerns my son and his relationship with drugs. And so I said to her, why don't you and I just discuss that after the group? Because it was obviously going to be very personal.
Yeah.
And she said, yeah, I'd like to do that. So when the group was over, she stayed. And I asked, one of the students there who was had a lot of experience with this because she was the senior administrator of the psychology department for juvenile justice in Southern California City. So she really knew this territory. And the woman recounted that she knew that her son was addicted and that he had started dealing. But she also knew that her son was not smart enough to be a good dealer. And it was just a matter of time before he got caught for dealing, which is a much more serious offense than for just taking drugs, at least in the States. And she had been advised by people that she respected that she should talk to the police and arrange to have her son arrested for possession so that he was not arrested for dealing and he would get drug treatment in the system. Well, this is a hell of a decision for a mother to make, right? And she said, I don't know what to do. And so we talked about this for quite a while. And at one point, she said, I'm just looking for a good solution here. And I said to her, I'm sorry to say, there is no good solution here. There isn't any good solution here. On the one hand, if you don't do anything and your son is arrested for dealing and faces a very long, difficult prison sentence, you'll feel terrible that you didn't do anything. On the other hand, if you arrange to have him arrested for possession, you're going to feel terrible about that. There isn't a good solution here. And I'm really sorry about that. But that's the situation. And she stopped. And it was very interesting. She relaxed. She went, oh, you're right. There isn't a good solution. And then she looked at me and looked at the other person and she said, I know what to do. And got up and left. Many years later, I ran into her. And she said, do you remember this? I said, oh, yes, I remember that evening very clearly. And I can't remember what she told me, but it had made a huge difference. But the thing is that by faced with the actual situation and coming to a resolution in herself, she didn't lose energy. It freed up energy for her to do what was necessary. And started to relate to life in a different way. So really going deep and facing the situation, facing the dilemma right head on, and accepting all of the implications of the dilemma. And going so deep in yourself that you find that clarity and understanding, which is way beyond words. That frees up energy, fills you with energy, because that is where you're talking about meaning. It is through that process, that full engagement in life, that you know what to do in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I realized this earlier when I talked about this resolving the contradiction. I wasn't realizing it, but I was actually thinking about resolving the contradiction, but not the kind of the answer or the dilemma. You know the difference.
Yeah.
So, because or at least if I talk from my own experience, and I think this is quite universal, we want to feel better. So if we have something that is kind of very uncomfortable, we try to get rid of that feeling. And it might lead to kind of a prematurely leaving the paradox or dilemma. Find something else to occupy your mind.
One of my students told me a story. Comes from, I think, South Africa. And it's about how lions or lionesses hunt. You know that a pride of lion has one male and 4 or 5 females.
Mm.
And the male is there to protect the females. It's the females who do all the hunting because they're lighter and faster than the males. So they can catch antelope. But lionesses, like all of us, get old. And when you get old, you get slower. So the old lionesses can't run as fast, but they're still part of the pride. It's the family. So what the pride of lions does, it stations the old females at one end of a valley, and they hide in the grass. Then the younger ones stalk the herd, cut out an antelope, and drive it towards the old females. And when the antelope gets close enough, the old females come out of hiding and roar. This frightens the antelope, and it goes back the way it came, right into the jaws of the young females, who can catch it because they're fast. And the adage of this story, the moral of the story, is go into the roar.
Mm.
And when we find ourselves experiencing a dilemma or a question, is completely counterintuitive, doesn't make sense from a logical point of view, but from a practice point of view and from a prayer point of view, from a spiritual point of view, it makes total sense. You go into that with whatever tools you've got. You can analyze it. That'll take you a certain distance. But at some point, especially if it's a deep and important one, you're going to run out of words. You're going to run out of ideas. And it's still going to be there. And now you have to go into it with your whole being. And you can't leave anything behind. And you don't know what you're going to have to jettison as you go forward in this. You don't know what's going to come up. That's what makes it so difficult. But when you engage it fully, most of the time something happens. As one person said to me, I feel okay even though everything is not okay. That's a mystical approach to life. It's not a rational one. I feel okay even though I know everything is not okay. This is a different relationship with life. And that's the opportunity that these dilemmas and questions offer us. And we can use prayer to go into it deeply. Praying, as that teacher advised me, pray until you run out of words, and then keep praying. So, I don't know whether any of this is helpful to you or not, but that's what I've learned.
Yeah, I think this is very, very helpful. Yeah. Another part of this was this sense of belonging and the loneliness you get from, if you feel like you have to kind of make your own path with that dilemma, and you cannot go with the group because of some things there. I don't know if is that part of the dilemma.
As far as I can tell, it's part of the path. Because by being willing to go into the dilemma in the way that we've been talking about, you're stepping out of the social consensus. And there are very few people who are going to follow you. So this loneliness that you talk about, as far as I can tell, is part of the path. Everybody I know that I've taught and colleagues, they all sense it. It's nice to get together with like-minded people. But even in so-called spiritual groups, you discover fairly quickly that there's really only a very small percentage who are doing that themselves. And because it's not about forming relationships, it's about coming to a different relationship with life. If you follow. Einstein said you can't solve problems at the level at which they form. And I'm very fortunate. I've found at various stages of my life like-minded people, and my relationships with them have been very important. But it's really only a handful. So, this speaks to the question in Islam: how do you create a society that embraces the divine? It's actually quite difficult.
Yeah, it is.
That itself is a dilemma. That's one that Bonhoeffer, for instance, pursued very deeply. And he wasn't alone. There are other people who've done
that. I think that there must be, in any given big group, there must be people with a little bit different set of core questions that they
Always.
have.
You go to a Catholic church, most Catholic churches, you ask the priest, how do you pray? Well, they may have some experience with prayer themselves, but they're just as likely to say, see Mrs. Brown back, who sits at the back of the church every Sunday? Go and talk to her about prayer. But she's just a grandmother. She's not doing it. You go and talk to her about prayer. I think it's important to get as clear about our own questions, as clear as we can. And then we just go. And we go where the questions take us. And we will meet people on the way. but we're very unlikely to build a community.
Yes, there's certainly a lot in this.
Okay. Enough to chew on for a while?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, a pleasure. And I kind of really like this. When we started this conversation, I was a little bit nervous about this because I'm not very clear with what I'm actually wanted to have a conversation with you. I have this kind of a vague understanding of the theme of this dilemma or the paradox. But during this conversation, I kind of felt that there was more than words that were shared.
Words only take us so far.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you picked that up. That's good.
I was actually quite interested about this Diamond Sutra also, but perhaps it's
Wait
too
till I
much.
finish the translation.
Yeah.
We'll have another conversation about this.
Yeah, sure.
Rather different topic, yeah, because we'd have to. No, I think we've covered some very important themes in this conversation, and I'm very glad to have explored them with you. And then we can have another conversation sometime down the road.
Yeah, I would love that. Okay. Tämä oli mielen laboratorio. Jos olet kiinnostunut jungilaisesta coachauksesta, lyhyt psykoterapeuttisesta työskentelystä tai työnohjauksesta esimerkiksi meditaation liittyen, ota yhteyttä lähettämällä sähköpostia osoitteeseen ap@mielenlaboratorio.fi. Tutustu myös kirjoihini Mielen laboratorio sekä Mindfulness, mielen selkeys ja myötätunto, joka löytyy nyt myös äänikirjana. Ja jos pidit jaksosta, jaa se myös ystävillesi, jotta hekin pääsevät syventymään oman mielensä labyrintteihin.